is absolutely delightful to see you again. It's been months, yeah, good few months now.
Yeah, it's been a while. Yeah, things have been busy over here, so it's been kind of hard to juggle everything.
Gotcha. How have you reflected at all on any of the conversations that myself or Joe have had with you in the last few before you sort of took some time away?
Yeah. But I mean, I'm always thinking about this stuff, so yeah.
Cool, awesome. So I understand that you had some questions for me today, and you sort of wanted to sort of reverse the tables a little bit, which I'm excited to hear about what that might be. So, yeah, whatever you want to do, yeah, let me see if I can answer them. I will do my best.
Yeah, so there's some elements that are still kind of confusing in my mind, so I was hoping I can ask some questions and kind of sort them out, and it might help the conversation later. But I guess we can start with just the question of epistemology. Like, what does it mean to you? I mean, you guys call yourselves street epistemologists, but what do you understand the term to mean?
Yeah, so I don't speak for the street epistemology movement, obviously. In the terms of street epistemology, I understand that what it means is just how we come to know what we know. So that is what we mean in the SE movement. Obviously, epistemology is a body of philosophy that describes the nature of knowledge, but specifically within the street epistemology community, I believe that they are just using it to mean the reasons why we believe what we believe.
Okay. So from your point of view, what do you think is the correct approach to knowledge, or how do you build your own knowledge?
So I have a mental model that I build in my head, I guess, that attempts to model observed information and reality as I understand it, as I encounter it, and I try to update that mental model when it proves to be inaccurate or make bad predictions. And so ever since I was a child discovering the world, I had a model of how I thought something was. I would continue to experience the world, and if that experience of the world proved that my mental model was inadequate, I guess I updated my model. I'm sometimes slow to update my model. I might not be great at noticing if my model is invalid, because we can't sort of run a simultaneous update of all the models in our head. So it's totally possible for me to have models of things that are contradictory, that I just haven't noticed. So sometimes reflecting on my own models, reflecting on how I understand the world, even just without any new information, I can come to notice maybe sometimes there are inconsistencies or contradictions in my models. But I do my best to make sure that they comport to what I think I perceive as reality. I can't know that it's reality. I can't know that there's any definitive truth out there. But I do my best to essentially update my models sufficiently that I can continue to operate in the world. These models, to be clear, are very much at different resolutions. So there are things that I think I have a better, more complex, more full understanding of, and things that I've got a very superficial and lightweight understanding of. And that's usually defined by need. If I need to know more about something, then I'll have a more complex model for that thing. So for example, I'm trying to learn Japanese. And my Japanese knowledge is a lot less sophisticated than my English knowledge. My model for Japanese language is a lot less sophisticated, but my Russian, for example, is borderline non-existent. So my Japanese model is much more sophisticated than my Russian model. And so that's just a function of need. So I'm choosing to learn Japanese, so I need to know more Japanese language, but I haven't chosen to learn Russian, and I have presently not identified a need in my world to understand Russian any better than I currently do.
Okay. I mean, we'll keep going with this line of question, but I'm wondering, do you see, like, is there a so you were speaking kind of how this applies to you personally, but how, if we're going to talk about how it applies to people in general, like, can we set a standard and say there's some kind of basis for what we see as the correct way of approaching epistemology? Like, for example, can we say something like people that are sufficiently intelligent to grasp the concepts involved and are sufficiently educated to know what the issues are in the discussion, and maybe that they're sufficiently unbiased or impartial to face the reality as it is, like if people meet that certain standard, then this is the position that they should arrive at, or I don't know if that makes sense, but
It sounds like
right.
you're trying to if I could recharacterize it slightly, who might convince us that we should adopt their models on the basis that they seem like a viable authority? Would that be a
So I'll flip that around and say, okay, is there a position about what reality is, or assuming there's different hypotheses of what reality is about, is there a position that the majority of intelligent, educated, unbiased people should adopt? Or is it more like there's multiple positions that are viable? Or
well, I don't believe I believe we're all operating in the same reality. And so the ultimate arbiter to whether our mental models are accurate or not would be reality itself. There may be multiple theories, hypotheses, models that can explain the observed phenomenon as best we understand it. And to the extent that they equally provide equal explanation, you could argue that they are equally viable in that sense. Although in some cases that might mean one would be an extraordinarily complex theory and one might be a very simplistic theory. And if they both explain the observed phenomenon, something like Occam's razor, another mental model, might give us an indication as to which one seems the most probable. And that doesn't mean that we can assert that we know that the other more complicated solutions aren't true. It just means that we might reasonably assume the simpler proposition to be the more likely.
Okay. So I guess overall, would you agree with that characterization? Like, if we say, I guess I'm trying to think of the characteristics of the maybe like a kind of the concept of a jury. Like, if we were going to have a discussion and have a jury to kind of decide how things are moving along, I picked those three characteristics because obviously, there's a certain level of intelligence required to process complex information, and maybe not everybody is capable of thinking about things that are extremely complicated in themselves. And then there's education. I mean, it's possible that some people just haven't been exposed to the material, so they, based on what they know, they're making the right decision, but they just don't have access to the broader knowledge available. And then unbiased is an issue of like, well, somebody might have access to the information, but they just prefer another option, and they're not really being fair in their evaluation, or and so on. So
Well, yeah, there would be all kinds of different reasons why somebody might have a incorrect conclusion, and it might feel like the truth. I mean, they always would feel like the truth, but yes, I mean, you could have bad information, you could have insufficient information, you could be building your hypotheses on foundational mental models that are inherently wrong, but from that foundational mistake, you've built an edifice of incorrect conclusions. That those are all totally viable. Yes, of course.
okay.
But I don't know. The idea of a jury, like that ultimately as a collective we can decide what is ultimately true, seems at odds in some ways, because I just think, as is the case with the jury, all members of that jury have their own independent assessment of the facts available to them, and we just assume that somehow, as a collective, where the majority of people are most likely to have the most fair-minded view. It's not truth, it's just representative of what's believed. And I think that's an important distinction. The jury still does not know what is true, but the jury would essentially have a reasonable representation of what most people might believe given the evidence.
Yeah. And in other words, I'm trying to avoid this sort of subjective, individualistic approach to things where, like, hey, this is my opinion, this is your opinion, they have equal value because you can't really tell them apart, type of thing. Like,
I can agree with that part. I think everybody's individual mental models are subjectively created and evaluated. It's the first person experience of their evaluation, but not all people's mental models are equally valid. There are invalid, and the way we might define them as invalid would be they do not comport to the observed phenomenon. For example, if your worldview, I mentioned this in a conversation recently, if the Pythagorean theorem of the h² = a² + b², if your worldview is that is not true, and the observed phenomenon is that is very true, that's a very reliable and dependable way of measuring the world, then I would argue that this invalidates your worldview. And so we need we can all have our own subjective experiences and views of the world, and you're welcome to have opinions, but ultimately the truth of the matter is the arbiter of whether or not your worldview is better or worse.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to maybe think about that and come back to it at a future time, because I agree with what you're saying, but at the same time, I think essentially those elements are sort of still processed through somebody's thought process. Like, sure, the Pythagorean theorem is valid, but we ourselves have to, like, I don't know, there's a subjective element there as well. So I think the best we can do is kind of have like we could say the majority of people that have an understanding of the issues. Yeah, I don't know. I have to kind of think how that goes. In principle, I'm in agreement with you, but I'm not sure. I have to kind of think that through a little more. So then, I guess, kind of trying to merge this with previous conversations we had. So I'm trying to trying to figure out, like, what is your sort of process for your understanding of reality. So what is your starting point, and how do you reason your way through? Is there like a starting foundation, and you feel like you're building on top of that foundation? What do you accept as a reliable position, and why, and things like that?
So my view in this space is that philosophy wants to find a bedrock philosophical truth from which they can build an edifice of certainty and confidence. And religion often wants to assert a conclusion from which they can drill down and build an edifice of confidence and truth. The reality is human beings are in the middle. We don't start with certainties. We don't have bedrock foundational truths, except for something like perhaps Descartes' cogito ergo sum. We seem to exist, and we seem to be in a reality. More than that, we can't say. And then we explore that from the middle outwards. We discover things, we test things, we build models, we refine those models. As we evolve and grow, we begin to notice there are common axioms, common patterns of behavior, and we start to refine our mental models into heuristics, which we find very useful to guide our processes. We do this from, as I say, the middle out. There's no foundational truth. There's just the person's experience of the world and the models that they construct to better understand that.
Yeah. In principle, I agree with what you're saying, but yeah, I'm wondering, like, how that plays out in once you start developing your thought process. So one of the things I was saying in the past, like in previous conversation we had, is that so we're making this assumptions, like you mentioned, I exist. That seems to be a fairly solid thing to accept, and then we seem to have to accept also that other people exist and that the world exists, because without those, everything else can kind of fall apart. I mean, if
it seems to be useful to take those as assumptions. I can't say that they're true. I just feel like it's useful to me to take those as assumptions.
Yeah.
I don't claim to know even. I could even see an argument to my own confidence that I exist. I mean, I could be the experience of a simulated entity that's just convinced of its own existence, and maybe there's no I in this machine. Philosophically, that's totally viable. I just think that operationally, it's useful for me to consider the idea that I exist and that reality is an existence external to me. Although my perception of reality is that it only exists around me. The reality exists as a bubble of my awareness. Anything outside of the bubble of my awareness effectively doesn't exist. except for things that might leave memory, or I might set expectations. So my wife right now is in the next room, so she's not within my sphere of awareness. That's effectively not existing as far as I'm concerned. But when I move into a space, I will expect her to be in her office or downstairs later on. And then, that expectation will be met with either, conclusive confirmation or be falsified. Maybe she's left the house and she's off to go and do something somewhere else. So, but I have what I think of as a memory of, what I think of as my wife, and I respond to that.
Yeah. That's kind of interesting. I was kind of drifting off a bit in thought when you mentioned the idea that you can falsify even the idea that you exist, because that kind of puts a cork in Descartes' whole philosophy. He said that that's the one undeniable fact, but maybe it isn't undeniable.
Well, the foundation is the idea that thoughts require a thinker, something that thinks, and it's a space where I'm philosophically uncertain, although I can't put my finger on it, and I would happily concede that it's a functional necessity, as in I take it as a truth. It's a de facto truth for me that I exist, and a de facto truth that the world exists around me, even though I can't, from first principles, define it and explain it, and may be wrong in my understanding of what it is. But functionally, I don't see any reason, I don't see any way around it, and I don't find any reflection in this space to be functionally useful to me. There's another example of this which I think is useful, which is that I can't see any reason why I do not live in a deterministic system. And so therefore I don't find any space for free will to exist, but I functionally will exist in the world as if I have free will, even though I can't identify where that free will exists, and believe that every next event has a prior cause, and that prior cause is always present, and therefore there's no space really for free will. However, that doesn't change the fact that I'm going to go downstairs and make coffee in the morning, watch Netflix, and sort of bimble around, maybe play video games in the afternoon. That feels like free will to me, even though intellectually, philosophically speaking, I can't find a space for a free will to exist. But but it's also not useful for me to to act as if it doesn't exist, or it doesn't appear to me.
Yeah.
Which of course was predetermined.
Yeah, that's kind of fun to talk about, to the point where I'm almost like distracted from the
My apologies. Yeah.
Because I treat free will kind of like a properly basic belief, because really without it, then you don't even know if what you're thinking has any value, because you're just determined to think it, and it has no.
Well, I mean, it certainly appears to have value to me, and that's all I can notice about it, right? My agency appears to be important to me. Whether that's because that's just how the precursive conditions have led me to act or feel about it is irrelevant. Like, it just does to me. So we might say we might at some point in the future discover that free will does exist, and that wouldn't necessarily disconfirm anything I've said. All I can say is I can see no space for free will, but will continue to act as if I and the other entities I perceive to be around me have free will, because it is the only way I can see to operate functionally within this system. And even if there is no I in the system, and maybe I'm just a part of the universe reacting in this way to what seems to me to be other parts of the universe, it really doesn't matter one way or the other to whatever the subjective experience of me in this moment is. So, I mean, I don't know if that makes it a properly basic belief, on the basis that I don't think you need it. I don't think you need the assumption that we have free will. We could just recognize the fact that we probably will operate on the assumption that we do regardless, or on the basis that we do. We'll treat it as a
what
truth.
I'm saying is that the claim that we don't is kind of a self-defeating claim, because we need some ability to determine whether we have it or not. But if we don't have it, then we can't make that determination, because we're just predetermined to arrive at some conclusion, So,
but there's no reason. So I could write a computer program where I created. I remember we talked about to Minecraft worlds before. So I could create a computer program, and in this computer program, I could have this entity have a variable inside of it that says believes in free will, true or false, and I can set it to true or false. and that entity, when asked, "Do you believe in free will?" will say true or false. Yeah, is what is free will, and it will say whether it's true or false. That doesn't mean the entity has free will. It just means that it would be operating with a parameter inside of its programming that dictates that it thinks it does. So I might well be a very complex variation of that.
Sure, from the outside in, you could definitely say something can be determined to believe it has free will. But for us ourselves within the system to make claims on this thing, we need free will to make the claim, because otherwise, we don't have
Why do we?
like there's no method for us to make any claim because we're just determined to say anything, so it's not like it's a truth claim.
But that may be the situation, but it will look the same to us that we have. It will feel the same to us for sure, but there's no need for that to be. I mean, it's interesting to try to notice, and it's funny because we were having this conversation recently. It's interesting to notice where the free will comes from. Like, what are we free from in this free will? Are we free from what prior causes do we need to be free from in order to make the decision? And where is this decision made? Because it's certainly there's no single part of my brain, for example, that makes a decision, and definitely the chemical state of my brain will definitely if I change the chemical state of my brain, I will definitely make very different decisions. So is it just the mechanics, the machinery of my brain? Well, it seems very likely that that's the case. The machinery of my brain is what determines the outcome. If I'm extraordinarily drunk, I will make vastly different decisions to when I'm sober. Right. And that's not, where's my free will in that? I don't choose to make different decisions in that moment. I may think I chose to drink, but I probably didn't choose that either. Right. There was a prior reason why that occurred to me to be an option. And if you follow that back, if we are just functionally the machinery in our brain and the choices we make are functionally the results of the machinery of our brain, I can't understand where this free will has crept in. Certainly feels like we have free will, don't get me wrong. I mean, I recognize the intuition, the feeling of it, but I can't intellectually understand where it comes from.
No, I know exactly what you're saying. I mean, I've heard a ton of arguments against free will. I'm just
What's the argument for free will?
In terms of functionality, like, it's very difficult to make. I mean, I think the best I've come up with is to build that off of some kind of a quantum randomness that essentially kind of breaks away from determinism and then goes from there. But I mean, it's just an unknown. But what I'm saying is, like, we assume it so that we have the capacity to say we're making any kind of truth claim beyond that. Because go ahead.
No, I think that's interesting. Now, I hear that often. The quantum indeterminacy is where we get free will from, but randomness is not freedom, right? To act fully randomly.
Randomness is not freedom, but it's closer to freedom than determinism. And then obviously there's something else beyond that, which we probably can't really. Yeah.
I would say if I was purely responding to a random system, then I would say that was just as limiting as purely responding to a fully deterministic system. I say, and in any case, there's no demonstrate. Whilst quantum indeterminacy is a problem to be solved in quantum physics and understood better in quantum physics, that we do not understand it sufficiently and that we can't build models to explain it. I don't think means that it's unexplainable. It just means we don't have models to explain it, or we don't have sufficient data, or an understanding of the universe needs to change in order to make predictions about it, perhaps. But quantum indeterminacy in any case has never been proven to move beyond the quantum realm. This is why the Schrodinger's cat experiment was constructed to demonstrate the idea that quantum events can't really be scaled up into the macro world in order to have a meaningful effect. They just don't. So I don't think quantum indeterminacy would change the equation for giving us free will in any case, nor would randomness. I wouldn't want to be determined by random events. I mean, that would just mean that my next action would be wholly unpredictable. So I don't think that gives you free will. I mean, free will suggests that there's somebody holding the controller and is able to input controls from somewhere outside of the system. I just don't see where there's any reason to believe that exists. So, I'm all for hearing an argument for free will. It was really interesting. We were talking the other day in the street epistemology community about what claims we would like to be properly, meaningfully challenged. And one of the lads there, and I totally agreed with it because I think it's the best answer, is that I really would like to hear a reason, an explanation for why I have free will. And I'd be really happy to be excited about understanding the world totally differently were I to discover a reason to believe that I have free will. But at the moment, as I presently stand before you, I just have no reason to do that. And I think it's that makes me say we don't have it. I presently don't have a reason not to believe that
Yeah,
we're
but I'm
deterministic.
not sure you follow what I'm saying with this. Like, I fully agree with you that there's no satisfying explanation for it. But what I'm saying is that if we don't have it, none of the rest of anything we do matters or has any meaning or any truth value. So even having a conversation here and saying I don't have free will, that just all that's saying is that means we're not really processing information going back and forth because, you know, you're determined to say this, I'm determined to react a different way. My opinions are determined based on whatever, and that's it. And, you know, like everything else is
Yeah, I hear that. I hear this as well, but I don't think that's necessarily true. Different pieces of this deterministic system could be now responding to each other, right? So for example, you could put some dye in some water, and you could shake your hand around in the water, right? And you know that's a good as an example of a chaos system as we can get. You know, like fluid dynamic processing is incredibly complicated, right? So you know, over a long enough timescales, the little bits of dye are going to be in all kinds of different places, but they're certainly going to be continuing to respond to each other. So if there's suddenly a jet of dye in one direction, it's going to push away the other pieces of dye, and little swirls will form, and little patterns will form, and they'll all cause other cause and effects relationships within the system, right? So this part of the deterministic universe that is me could be still having a perfectly relational conversation with another part of the deterministic universe that is you, and we could be affecting each other through the course of this conversation. So I don't feel like it there is a sort of, it's almost like the ultimate nihilism to say that you're in a deterministic system, that nothing matters, nothing is real. But I disagree with that. I still think, firstly, because we have the perception, the feeling that it matters, it might as well matter. We might as well treat it as if it matters. And secondly, I don't necessarily think that it means that there's no meaningful interaction between different parts of the universe. We are, so somebody said once quite beautifully, I don't know who said it, but you know, that consciousness is the universe becoming aware of itself. And I quite like that idea. I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what else I can say to that topic, but yeah, it just, I mean, you know, the complexity is going to exist in a determined universe. That's not the question. And the complex interactions or whatever kind of interaction will exist. But the idea that any of this is in any way related to reality seems like there wouldn't be a basis for it without free will, because it would just be the result of some kind of very complex domino effect. So, you know, the idea that we can have a conversation here trying to understand or come closer to truth, closer to reality, closer to fact, I don't know. I don't know if that can work on it.
But that sounds like an argument from incredulity, though, doesn't it? The kind of the feeling that, you know, I can't. It feels wrong,
No,
so
I'm just saying,
it's
like,
wrong. You know, like it
there's
feels
no
like
basis for it, because whatever conclusions we're drawing, they're just determined to be there. They're the effect of a million interactions that are just predetermined, and you know, that's no reason to. Yeah.
But there is a basis for it, right? We observe cause and effect phenomenon in the world, right? We're aware of the relationship and the flow of time. We're aware of the nature of the change of things over time. So you know, there is a basis for believing that we live in a deterministic universe, right? There's no. Let's imagine there were two universes, right? One is fully deterministic, but as sufficiently complicated as it would need to be in order to result in two entities right now deterministically thinking that they're having a conversation, but actually they're just two bits of the system, you know, bouncing off of each other, right? But that's that universe. And then there's another universe where we actually are, as it feels like we are, conscious entities with free will having a conversation. Could you imagine that both those universes in this moment might look the same? It would be possible for them to look the same?
Well, yeah, it depends. Yeah, I don't know. To me, the universe that has free will, at some point, the individual entities that have free will can sit back and reflect on reality and come to some kind of conclusions that actually are based on the information they've processed, and they can come to the valid conclusion. While a determined universe seems to me like it would just be like everybody is determined to come to their specific conclusion based on lot of factors, not based on, yeah, they've actually made sense of the information and they processed it and that's their conclusion, you know? So I don't know.
Yeah, it destroys the illusion of self. I agree, but would you feel that it would be at least possible that there could be a universe that in this exact moment would feel identical, but be fully deterministic? Like, however complicated it would need to be, you would set a fully deterministic system into motion, and eventually it would get to a situation where you and I are having this phone call over what seems to us to be, you know, communicating ideas, what seems to us to be the internet, and all of the complexity that involves. But that system could have been done fully deterministic.
I can record this conversation and program it into a computer and have it replicate everything we've done. So that would be the equivalent of a determined reality, you know?
Yeah. So we built a computer program that simulates the entire universe up to this moment, and up until this moment, everything's just been determined by the computer. And we wouldn't be able to tell, I don't think, the difference between that universe, the fully deterministic one, and this one where we presently believe that you would believe that we have free will. And I don't know that we don't have free will. I just have no reason to believe that we do. And whenever I ask for arguments for what free will is, I tend to get told something like, it just feels like we do, or it wouldn't make sense if we didn't. But that's not true. It does make sense. It could totally be deterministic, right? I think we would agree with that, right? It could be deterministic.
Sure. I mean, like I said, you know, we could build a universe that is deterministic, that just replicates everything that has already happened exactly the way it's happened.
Right.
But again, from the point of view of us being inside of it, we make that one assumption in order to be able to like process everything else. Anyway, like I'm having this conversation, but it's like a conversation I've had in my head 1,000 times, and I don't think there's a solution to it. And I think we're just gonna keep going in circles. So, I mean, I enjoy it, but
happy to move on.
I do want to ask you a few more questions before we get too far, because we're already kind of coming up on the hour, half an hour at least. I guess I'm wondering, like, you know, we talk about, hey, there's some basic assumptions we're making, like we said this several times before. We exist, you know, other minds exist, the world seems to exist, and then we're making those assumptions so that we can start building from there, based on, you know, hopefully from that point on, kind of building on some kind of scientific foundation. So we're you know, we're not just believing stuff on feeling, intuition, other things, even on philosophical speculation, but we're actually trying to demonstrate things as they go. So, you know,
we're updating our models,
and we're doing our best to update them on verifiable scientific evidence that, you know, we recognize that even science has its limits and we can never be 100% certain. But the more we go and the more we experiment and test things out and they get confirmed, then we have more and more confidence that develops in those things, and we sort of build from there, right? Am I going kind of in the right direction there?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, we have models, we build and improve, we iterate. Yeah. The thing that would change my mind about the idea of there being a consistent external reality would be observational parameters that disturb that. So if in this next moment I suddenly found myself on a flying rock in space, and then in the next moment I was underwater, and then in the next moment I was back here again, I would start to have to update my mental models about that experience. And so maybe one of the conclusions I might come to is that reality is inconsistent, as in my experience of where I am, and maybe the situational events are not as I thought they were. And the reason I would update my model is because there's new phenomenon that I would need to explain, and so take into consideration.
This is kind of a good side, or what kind of a good detour to go with. What would make the difference between you updating your models, assuming you're experiencing this sort of different, like, weird reality?
Weird reality.
How would you determine that you need to change your model of reality, or you need to change your model of your own sanity or your own processes working?
I wouldn't be able to. I don't think we have a model labeled reality in our head. We have a series of models connected to the concept of our experience. And so it's not as simple as just saying, well, I'll go to the filing cabinet marked reality, pull it out and make an amendment. I would have to just build in what my new set of experiences were based on based on those experiences. So it could very well be that I've lost my mind. It could very well be that I'm being drugged, or I'm sick, or something like that has occurred. It could be that the reality as we know it is unstable, or maybe I'm having a seizure. You know, all kinds. Or I'm dreaming, and maybe I'm asleep. All kinds of things could be the case, and I wouldn't draw likely any strong conclusions from those immediate phenomenon, but I would have to be just very aware that those sorts of things can happen. So for example, I might now have to update the idea that in this next moment it's possible that I could feel like I'm somewhere else, if that was the sort of weird sort of thing that was happening to me. And I would just have to, you know, if that kept happening to me throughout my lifetime, I would just have to build it in as a reality
so
that I might experience.
The fact that there's some kind of consistency might make it more likely that it's more than just your perception of reality, that maybe reality itself is
No, just its consistency wouldn't mean it was anything more like wouldn't necessarily mean it was more likely to be about reality or about my perception of it. It would just mean that it was consistent. It kept happening, and I would have to update my mental model to say that this phenomenon was inconsistent. I couldn't say whether it was reality or me that was becoming strangely disconnected in this sense. I could just say that this is an experience I would need to understand, right?
Okay. You wouldn't have that in your mind as two options and say, okay, at this point I think this is more likely, at this point I think this other option is more likely, as in like, yeah, okay.
Maybe, yeah. I would probably build hypotheses and say, like, you know, maybe, you know, how I would think back, you know, is there any other symptoms of sickness? Have I eaten anything weird? You know, have I, how, you know, all kinds of other factors. I mean, this is where this sort of thought experiment space gets woolly, because of course it's not just an isolated experience, right? There's context, or at least there's the perception of context, which might not be real, you know, but there's the perception of context that we take in, and we use those contexts as well as the observed phenomenon to try to update our models more accurately.
So, okay, yeah. So what about other people around you kind of having similar experiences? Would that be like an additional confirmation? Like, let's say you're talking to other, you know, maybe other scientists out there, and they're all noticing this thing about reality where it kind of keeps shifting like that, like you mentioned.
Yeah, the classic thought experiment of being in a desert, looking at you know, and you suddenly see a lake of perfect water, you know, your oasis on the horizon, and you say, okay, you know, if there's two people there, and one of you can see it and one of you can't, right? One of you's clearly mistaken. Possibly you're both mistaken, but it seems more likely that one of you is mistaken. But if there's 5 people there and only one of you can see the oasis, you might start to reasonably question whether it was just you that was seeing the oasis. Although, interestingly, within your perception, the fact that there are 4 other people there is also equally apparent to you in your own perception. But if those 4 other entities also seem to agree that they also seem to exist, I guess you got to go with it. You can only really react to what it seems to you to be what's available to you to react to. I mean, you can't. There's no bedrock truth that you can get to that ultimately says, okay, I can stand on this point, and then from all other points I can be certain. I just don't think we have access to that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think everything we said so far, maybe we didn't say it the way it's usually said by, you know, say a professional philosopher that's kind of working through their epistemology, but neither am I.
I'm not a professional philosopher, yeah.
Messing around with this stuff, but I think we're making the same points that everybody has made for thousands of years when it comes to, you know, how to.
Oh yeah, nothing's new here. Yeah.
So I guess the one move that I kind of made in my approach to stuff in previous conversations we had was that, you know, we start with these basic assumptions about certain things having to be taken for granted, and then we build our knowledge from there. And I said, yeah, but those things we take for granted need an explanation. So they can't just be accepted as is. Like, obviously, the fact that we exist, the fact that the world exists, this implies that they got here somehow. And the next step I took after that is to say there's several possible hypotheses, and we could kind of like take all the available hypotheses and sort of push them into categories and say, okay, here's one option, here's another, and so on, and kind of limit them so we could discuss them. So, you know, my question to you, for example, would be like, how do you imagine reality to have come to existed going back all the way to the beginning point? Because we've talked about this very briefly. I think I watched a video that we did, like I think our very first conversation, within about a 5 to 10 second span, you mentioned something about the options you see as being the possible way that everything started, and you kind of said they're all.
Well, my answer to how everything got started is pretty simple. I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, we've said that about several other things so far. Like, we don't know, for example, if we're noticing some anomalies in reality, we don't know if it's in our head or if it's out there, So we acknowledge the fact that in certain situations, the starting point is we don't know, but then we can have hypotheses about, of what options are there and which one is more plausible.
Yeah, but we could build hypotheses, but given that we've got nothing to base those hypotheses on. So, for example, I can build a hypothesis that we are in a deterministic system based on my observations that seem to be apparent to me in this system that I appear to be in. I can't know for sure that it's a real system. I can't know for sure that I'm not a Brownian of Pascal's demon, etc., etc. But I can be pretty confident that it seems consistent with me that the rules of cause and effect are in play, and given that those rules have never seemed to be broken by anything, that ultimately, if I acknowledge my own awareness of my own self and my own thought processes, and I can see that one thing follows another, then ultimately I can't understand why we would have free will. So from what I'm observing in the immediate moment, I can predict reasonably, I can extrapolate backwards and say that it seems to me that there's no reason to believe we are not in a deterministic system. But as regards to the origins of the universe, it seems I'm so far removed from that concept that it seems to me that I don't know is the only reasonable rational answer. I've tried to trifecta it in the sense that the reality as we know it is either infinite, finite, or something else, and all three of these things I cannot understand. This would make no sense to me intellectually. If it's an infinite universe, I don't understand how that makes sense. I can't understand how that could go on for infinity. If it's finite, then what was before? What did this finite thing exist into? If we're talking not just about our universe, but I'm talking about reality, whatever that universe is in and whatever that thing is in, and eventually all of this, if all of this existence is finite, then how did that happen? If existence itself, reality itself is finite, what does that even mean? And then if it's something else, if it's something other than infinite or finite, I don't know what that means either. That's just completely unintuitive to me. So I can say the only thing I know about the origin of the universe and the nature of the universe is that I don't know.
Yeah, usually when we use the words infinite and finite, they're understood as being like an A non-A situation, like they're complements of each other. So, I guess
sure, yeah,
they could be defined differently than that, I guess, but I'm not sure what other thing there is between.
I put in something else as an equally improbable example. I mean, because it doesn't change anything for me. Whether it is an A or not A situation with regards to infinite or finite. Neither of those two things make any sense, and neither would there being a third option. Although my awareness of infinite versus not infinite, for example, is grounded in my present models of reality. So the fact that could be a third option in here that I'm that is so far removed from my experience seems actually quite likely, given that the first two seem improbable. But in any case, even if that is the case. Yeah. I also don't understand it. So the only thing I can say for sure about the nature of the universe is that I simply just don't understand it, and it's just as honest as I can be about my reflections on that.
Can I ask you this question? Like, do you think, for example, that the idea that the universe started by something coming out of nothing, is that a valid point, or is that an invalid?
But this is this ex nihilo would be a finite universe, right? That it had a beginning, and it just makes no sense to me. How does that happen? And I don't know. And look, you can posit God. You could say God created it ex nihilo, but then whenever a theist is asked, well, where did God come from? Well, God is infinite. Well, okay, well, fine. But then it's either infinite or finite. And if God is somehow outside of space and time, outside of the universe, there's no explanation for God. All of the problems that we have with reality are just now elevated one level up, and now we wave them away when we talk about it being something that comes from a God. We just say, oh no, but God has these properties because he necessarily has to have these properties. Why would you say that God, this entity God, must exist and not ascribe those realities just to the reality itself? Maybe reality just has those properties. It seems arbitrary to me. But in any case, it's like, you know, if you want to say reality, or you want to claim that, well, God created reality, God is either infinite, finite, or something else, and either way, it makes no sense to me intuitively.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess one way to categorize it is that infinite, finite, or something else. I usually think of it as in terms of, well, here we're going to run into the problem we had before with the difference between natural and supernatural. But the distinction, I think I said this before, right? Like because you actually caught me one time. I made one of my videos. And then you came back later and you said, hey, this is a false dichotomy. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, so we spoke about the nature of it. So either the supernatural or natural. That means it's either A or not A, right? Which is basically, that would be a valid assertion, but it's sort of redundant. It's just saying I don't know with more steps, right? And if we say that reality is A or B, as in there's the natural world and then there's something different, not the negation of the natural world, not the opposite, not the antonym of the natural, but the supernatural world is some other thing. But then that's more of an A or B scenario, which seems like a false dichotomy, because why would it just be that thing or the other thing? Why can't we invent a C or a D or an E? So that would be a false dichotomy in my view.
So the way I kind of break it down is to say, okay, if we have the option natural, supernatural, but then the supernatural could be God or not God. So, and the distinction is this, like, let's say we have the idea of the supernatural. God would be somebody that's self-aware and intelligent and things like that, versus not God would be something other than that. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. I might be like, anyway.
It makes sense. I don't know how it gets us further, but I'm with you. Okay, yeah. So we've got natural, supernatural with God, and supernatural without God. Is that right? Okay, yeah.
Because if I just say there's the natural and then there's God, there's some kind of in between there where you could say, well, that might not be natural, but it's not necessarily God either. So I'm creating that third space for the leftovers kind of thing.
Okay, so let's just return to that point of clarification, because do you believe that the supernatural is whatever is not natural, or do you believe the supernatural is a very specific
so if we define supernatural
thing?
as whatever is not natural, but then if we say that has to be God, it doesn't have to be God. It could be something that's supernatural. It doesn't matter that we know what it is, right? So things can only be natural or supernatural. There's no third option. Okay. So in this case, is this not just saying? So, and how are we defining natural? We've kind of tried to go over that. We spent quite a bit of time where you ended up kind of hitting a wall. But I guess the way I was looking at things is that, you know, we have the universe, for example, right? And we say this thing needs an explanation. So natural mean that the universe can explain its own existence. So basically you trace it back all the way to some beginning point, and it, however, either it's infinite or finite, however, pretty much what you said is just this sort of cause and effect thing that developed into what we have today, however it starts. Yeah.
So could we say that the natural world is the knowable world, what we could come to know about the reality?
So that's another conversation we started. I never had time to do a response to that. So knowable, I guess I'm kind of making a difference between things that we know and the hypothetical that we can imagine as far as what the possibilities are, right? Because like we said before, knowable, we can only reach so far with our knowledge. You know, we could only observe like 1/10 of the universe.
Right. So there's presently there's things that we
Yeah.
presently know, right? So that's a very small circle. And then there's things that we could, in theory, if we knew everything about reality, like based on our observations and our experiences within this unit reality, then all knowable things would be essentially
No,
what you would consider to be natural. Would that be fair?
Rules out the supernatural by definition. Yeah.
Right. It would.
Yeah.
It
So
would. That's why
I
I
don't
was
know if this is a good
struggling. Yeah.
analogy, but you know, I was thinking, okay, let's say I look at a collection of objects that have some kind of arrangement, like some pieces of something on the table that are arranged in a certain order, right? One option is that they've arranged themselves that way. So, for example, imagine you have several pieces that are magnetic, and they're on the table, and they just sort of attract to each other, and they set up some kind of arrangement because of their intrinsic properties. So that would be natural, right?
Yep.
Supernatural might mean something like, hey, it was windy outside, whatever, there was an earthquake, and those things sort of positioned themselves, but there was some other force that caused them to position themselves in that particular arrangement. So it wasn't intrinsic to them, and it wasn't like a conscious decision. And then the God option would be, some kid passes by, picks the pieces together, and arranges them in some kind of formation. So that's intentional. Like the kid actually said, "Oh, I want to build a face, or I want to build a house, or whatever." So I don't know if that makes that.
All right. It still has it. I still struggle with it because I mean I wouldn't look if there was the wind, I consider the wind natural. If there was some other, when you say force, if we're talking about a force that can interact with our reality, then I would say that was natural also, right? Any force that's interacting with reality is by definition, in my view anyway, natural, and that we could come to understand that force and the nature of that force. If we're saying
basically that's the place we kind of got hung up in previous conversations, because you're sort of making this connection and saying anything that interacts with our reality is natural by definition.
Well, okay. Would it be helpful if I considered it to be things that interact with our reality but could still be supernatural?
Yeah,
is that more useful for this conversation?
Good.
But Mike, it feels to me like when we talk about supernatural, what we're talking about is a special case. We're sort of philosophically considering that we want to consider this set of circumstances to be special cased, so that we can say that they're not bound by the laws of our universe. They're not bound by the problems of observable phenomenon. I mean, I'm not trying to be abrupt by this, but I'm just really honestly trying to see, because we do keep entering into this space, right? So does that feel fair? That because it feels like we want to treat the sort of magical, sort of supernatural, magical is low, but we want to treat this special supernatural stuff as if it has unique properties that can both interact with our reality but also not be really observed or tested or seen, so that we can now say that there is a supernatural realm and it has an influence on us, but we can't also detect it and we can't also interact with it, and that's possible. And it just feels like we're creating quite a special case for this that I don't know why we would believe it exists. So what is the reason? I guess I would ask, what is the reason you feel that such a supernatural realm exists?
So I don't fully agree with the previous stuff, in the sense that I'm not trying to make a special case for something to interact that's undetectable necessarily. Basically, like when it comes to any object out there, we can say that we can break things into those three categories. Either it made itself, it was made intentionally by somebody, and then there's that middle ground where it was made by something other than itself, but it wasn't intentional. It was some kind of something caused it to happen, but it wasn't like an intelligent architect that set it up or whatever, or engineer.
Right. I think last time we spoke about there could be a sandwich on my desk, right? And the sandwich could have come about ex nihilo. I could have an ex nihilo sandwich, or my wife could have made me a sandwich. Mm-hmm. These are both competing hypotheses for the presence of the sandwich on my desk. it's totally possible that the sandwich could have come about ex nihilo. It's totally possible that God could have put the sandwich on my desk and interacted with me in that way, or it's possible that my wife created the sandwich for me. I'm not trying to strawman you, and this might sound uncharitable, but based on what you've said, I'm not sure whether you would consider the wife hypothesis in this situation as natural or supernatural, because I think you mentioned the idea that it could have been created or designed by somebody. This sandwich was designed and created by what I believe to be my wife, who I treat as a conscious entity. So would you consider the wife hypothesis a natural or supernatural
basically
hypothesis?
A different scenario, because I'm using it as an analogy. Like, I'm trying to create an analogy by giving natural examples for something that we cannot explain, or it's hard to have a conversation about the supernatural. So then I'm saying, okay, here's a natural analogy that can kind of illustrate the difference between those three categories that I'm bringing up. Essentially, like, there are sets, so like if we make the whole universe as a set, then something outside that set would have to interact with it in some way, and so on. So I don't know. Again, I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, it's totally possible. I mean, I couldn't disprove it. Yeah. I mean, like, I just want to try to understand why we would presuppose that.
It's not a presupposition. It's a hypothesis. So we have the universe. So we exist. Other people exist. The universe exists. There's this physical material reality that we understand and interact with, and the question is, how did it get here? And one possible option is that it developed on its own through the intrinsic properties of matter and the forces of the universe. But one option is that it didn't happen that way.
Yeah.
So what is the alternative? The alternative is either it was some kind of mind that did it intentionally, or it was something else.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, in the example of it's either a mind or not a mind, I would agree that it's one of those two things. But that not a mind category is almost infinitely large, presumably, right? I mean, there's an awful lot of things that could go into the not a mind category, and in any case, the problem still would exist for that mind. How did that mind come into existence? Like we still the infinite regression, for example, doesn't terminate at God. It just tends to be that people go, and therefore God, and there's a mind that created everything, and that's an end to it, right? So we don't have an explanation. We've just moved the explanation one entity further up the chain, and hypothesized this God. And then how did this God come into existence? Well, if the God is infinite or finite, or maybe the entity that is God, this complex mind entity that is God, maybe the pieces of the universe constructed it ex nihilo. We've got all of the problems still, and all we've now done is hypothesized an incredibly complicated entity that explains this present set of circumstances, but we've still got all of this explanation left. That is still feels to me like a problem. How do you believe God came into existence?
What I'm saying is that whichever of these three options you choose, the beginning point is the problem you've mentioned at the beginning. It's like an unexplainable. I mean, whether you go to the natural thing, the God thing, or something in between, you have the situation where it's either finite or infinite or something else, like you said. So.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I say I don't know, because I can't decide between those things. And maybe there's a God that created that God, and maybe it's gods all the way down infinitely. I don't know, but like, I don't know seems to be the only rational response to this problem. And I'm not trying to be dismissive of the wide range of people with different views, but I personally, I just don't understand how I would move beyond I don't know in this space. I sort of sometimes think about it like I think somebody I've used the analogy of ants trying to understand the London Stock Exchange, for example, right? I think I might have mentioned that example to you. You've got these ants sort of trying to understand why concrete's suddenly being poured on their nest, right? They've got no idea. And the reason is that the London Stock Exchange, some money was traded on there, and a company became richer, and now a new car park is being built, and the cement's coming down. And like, for an ant, like it's just the end of days, right? And then that's an end to it. And their capacity to understand and rationalize and comprehend the world around them is not nearly sophisticated enough to imagine a full and detailed explanation of what's going on in their world. And I don't necessarily consider myself in much more of a privileged position than the ant. I mean, it would be surprising to me if I had the tools available to me to intuitively understand the nature of the universe. It would be surprising, I think, given our origins. I mean, do you believe in evolution? I don't know if we've spoken about that, but do you believe evolution was a process that we've been through or going through?
Personal view on the thing, but I'm more or less okay with most of the stuff. But
if we're evolved creatures, then it would seem that reasonably that we are evolved to operate within the space that we operate. Like we're evolved to climb trees, run away from tigers, find food, and procreate, right? And functionally, we've just got more complex at that. We've now learned to adapt our environment. But the one thing we haven't necessarily found it useful to do is evolve the ability to intuit the nature of the universe. I mean, it just doesn't seem useful on a day-to-day basis. There's too many cartoons and things to watch on Netflix for a start. I mean, like if I'm going to be busily, contemplating the nature of the universe all the time, it might be rather distracting. So I just don't think it's become, evolutionarily speaking, I can understand why I don't have the tools to understand the nature of reality. Hell, we know there are wavelengths of light that we can't see, right? We know there are sounds that we can't hear that exist in our reality that we do know exist, but we have no ability to detect them or be aware of them until such time as we built tools to discover this. And so why we feel that as as evolved creatures, we would have the tools, more just like the ant wouldn't know about the London Stock Exchange, why would we as human beings be able to intuit the nature of the universe? I just, and that's not to say we shouldn't try, and it's certainly not to discourage anybody that's got a viable hypothesis. But when it comes to these fundamental questions, I just think for the most part, I don't know is the only real.
I fully agree with what you're saying, but here's my issue with some of this, and that is that it seems like a contradiction to say I don't know on the one hand, and it's unknowable, and on the other hand, to give more value to one option than the other, like to say, okay, it's more reasonable to go with this angle or another angle. And I understand why somebody would choose to go with one, because, hey, you have to live your life, and you could say, hey, I need to choose an option, or this one makes the most sense to me, and I'm going to pick it. But, like to go beyond that and say, if somebody else is going with another option, it doesn't seem rational, or it doesn't seem reasonable, or something. So that's my question there.
Sure. So yeah, I understand it. It seems disagreeable, and I hope I don't come across as disagreeable, but I can see how I might, for sure. So let me put it this way. Sometimes I think about this in terms of children, babies, right, growing up, right, before you know anything, you're just hungry and you're pooping, and that's it. You're either asleep, pooping, or hungry. That's the three states of babies, right? And then eventually, you begin to learn things, develop social skills, understand language, comprehend the world around you. You get object permanence. That's an exciting thing that occurs, and now all of a sudden you're starting to explore reality, right? At that point, I don't think there's any babies out there that believe in the Quran, for example. I don't think there are babies out there that believe in the Hadith. I don't believe there are any babies out there, for example, that believe in the Bhagavad Gita or the Book of Mormon or the any of the religious texts, right? Or the ideas of religion. I don't think any babies out there are holding those views. I think that as they get older, they are introduced to these ideas by people that honestly believe them, and honestly have got a massively huge, wide range of reasons why they believe them, right? Very complex, sophisticated reasons why they believe these ideas. So these ideas are given to the children, and they grow up to learn them, or they're presented to these children as maybe even teenagers and adults. Maybe they grow up an atheist and at the age of 40 become introduced to these ideas and find them powerfully persuasive. But in any case, the default position, in my view, biologically speaking, is not to believe anything. You don't believe in things until you're given a reason. So the challenge I have is, are the reasons sufficient to change my view from not believing in something to believing in something? So it's not a case of sorry, just a real quick, I just want to point out, so for me, it's not about whether or not we should be all allowed to believe what we have different beliefs. It's just that if I cannot see a good reason personally for believing it, I am going to think that the other person might well be wrong to believe it. And if that other person can explain to me why I'm wrong, then that's great. That would really benefit me.
I don't know. I hope I'm not coming across as like trying to argue against what you're saying or anything. Like, I'm actually trying to hear where you're coming from.
No, this is good. I
the only
like
way
it.
I know how to do it is by actually kind of putting stuff out there and letting you take it down. So I'm not really a professional at the SE thing. So anyway,
I got you.
Now I kind of forgot my I wanted to go to address a side issue, but I think it's important. But one of the things I noticed, and what's your friend's name? Is it Joe? Yeah. You guys kind of merge
Joe,
several steps together. Like, for example, the question of God as generic with God as specific to some religion. And to me, these are different categories that have a different epistemological methodology to tackle. And the example I might use is kind of like in evolution, where scientists always say, like, hey, abiogenesis is not evolution, it's something else. It's a different mechanism. Separate those two. Because, like, the idea of God is sort of a foundational question. Like, what people do that after that, Book of Mormon, Bhagavad Gita, whatever, that's a whole different process. But again, when it comes to the issue of the possibility of God, like, I understand, that there's some basic things that you got to do to function, to exist. But what I've tried to do is because we are having a philosophical discussion. I mean, epistemology is philosophy, whether it's street or not, it's inherently a philosophy, like we're having a philosophical conversation. And what I've tried to do is to tie the issue to the fact that we already do exist and we need to explain that. So to say, I don't know, no, we definitely don't. But if we're going to have a philosophical discussion, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to sort things out. So we could always say we don't know, but in the end, if we have several hypotheses, if we say we don't know, that means those hypotheses, they're relatively equally plausible, and whatever people choose, they choose. The minute we say no, this is inherently more probable, we're kind of making a knowledge claim. So at that point, that knowledge claim has to be defended.
Right. Yes. Well, I think we're making a knowledge. Well, I don't think atheism is a knowledge claim, and I know this always gets bogged down in definitional problems. But my version of atheism is not a knowledge claim. My version of atheism would be sometimes what's referred to as agnostic atheism. I don't know, but functionally, I don't think human beings operate in a space of truth and certainty. We operate in a space of sufficient conviction to justify action, right? So to me, I'm not sufficiently motivated by the concept of God or gods or religions being true to act in the world in line with the idea that those things are true.
That's
so
fine,
I do not act in the world in line with that idea.
Atheism is not one of the contenders when we're talking about approaching things from this angle, because if we're talking about, we exist, why do we exist? You don't say, well, atheism is one solution. No, one solution might be naturalism, or you might call it like atheism is a negative construct. It tells you what you don't believe in, but it doesn't make a claim, and a hypothesis has to be a claim.
It doesn't tell you what you do.
Anyway,
exactly, I agree.
Yeah.
I'm very glad we cleared that up.
A friend of mine is waiting
that gets annoying when it gets wrong.
And I didn't realize we were going to go this far past 12 o'clock. I know you said to wait a little bit. Let's keep in touch and maybe continue on a different day, if it's okay with you.